The conference, I said, is focused on the demographic changes happening across the world at different stages and different rates. And in some cases, particularly in countries in the global south, which have not followed the assumed paths or conventional theories, which are often based on different histories and experiences of the developed and industrial countries in the global north. And we're considering those demographic changes through the lens of what has come to be the dominant concern of most populations, of most politicians and the media, i.e. the economy. So it's the getting and spending of money, and through taxation, the source of a government's expenditure on its national programs and public services, education, health, defence, transport, infrastructure, etc. And it's a lens which increasingly, especially in the measure of GDP, gross domestic product, and the valuing of growth above all else, is seen as too narrow, incomplete a definition of human activities, our purpose, our needs, and indeed the impacts upon our planet. So we're very fortunate today to have that growing body of respected economists, demographers, and development experts represented amongst our speakers today, and critically representing a complementary diversity of countries and views from both the global north and the global south.
When your population growth rate is above a certain level, when your fertility rate is above a certain level, your process of economic growth is severely set back by what is called capital shallowing.
I know that in the 1970s, Sub-Saharan Africa was sufficient in food supply, and that's a fact. So what is happening? Why aren't we now self-sufficient in food supply? And you can link it to the population. We're going faster than we are using technology. So we need to have it at the same end. How do we slow the population growth rate down so that technology can serve us?
You can't really think about improving the well-being of people in these countries in a sustainable manner if you do not tackle simultaneously issues related to population growth, as well as issues related to the environment and improving their capacity to adapt.
I think it is politically very irresponsible to put pressure on young couples to have more children in a high-consuming country. Not only environmentally, we know it's not good for women, it's not good necessarily for communities.
Part of building a resilient economy is to look at ideas, notions that I'm going to speak about, not as a zero-sum game. Like if you did this, you'd probably lose something else. If you cut down your consumption, you'll probably lose your standard of living. We shouldn't be looking at this as a zero-sum game, but in fact, as a win-win for the wider economy and the natural ecosystems.
Our continued pursuit of growth, it won't last anyway. We will bump into limits one way or another. So in the stabilized world scenario, we choose our own limits. And we can either choose our own limits or bump into one.
So addressing overshoot, addressing these compounding crises of climate and biodiversity loss, all of it, the purpose is human health and well-being. The purpose is the wonder of our fellow species on planet Earth. And the purpose is justice.
Many regard climate change as the most significant challenge to future economic growth, in fact. For two reasons. First of all, climate change will create climate damages to the economy, which will reduce the growth rate. And climate policy itself will increase the cost for production and limit consumption, which also will reduce growth.
You can see this dotted blue line. This is from the IPCC. This is where we're going if we don't change. And that will take us to an increase in average temperatures of 4 to 5 degrees by the end of the century. We need to change regardless of the social and economic cost, because this is existential. No matter what it means for the economy, we have to cut the level of emissions. We need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 8% a year. This is a United Nations figure. And by 60% by 2030. And that's then to zero by 2040, not net zero. Now, because emissions are one-to-one tied with economic output right now, that means shrinking the economy. It means shrinking the economy, the global economy, by 8% a year. We also need to reform agriculture, make it much more localized and stop the use of nitrate fertilizers in particular. We need to stop all deforestation. And in the long term, we need to build hundreds of carbon capture plants to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere for several centuries to come. And if we do all that, we'll have about a 50-50 chance. This is going to need some very radical thinking to make sure that people are as safe as possible and that they are able to survive through the transition.
What you are seeing now is that really there's this what you might call a double tragedy in a way, that the countries that are least resilient, the countries that are least capable of coping to the consequences of climate change, they are also facing the most rapid population growth. And the combination of these two factors are actually undermining these countries' capacity to develop altogether.
These rapidly growing populations are often talked of as a demographic dividend. There's a lot of chat among politicians of, we have the youngest population of the world. We have the great advantage of our working age population is growing at 10 million per annum. Let's take that from India. But have a look at India and look at what is happening actually in the Indian labor market, even in the years where there is rapid economic growth. Broadly speaking, what is happening is that the Indian working age population is growing at about 10 million per annum, but the number of jobs in what is sometimes in India called the formal sector of the economy or the organized sector of the economy is growing not at all. Absolutely not at all. And so the number of people who are underemployed or underemployed in the informal economy just continually grows. Because what you have in the formal economy is there are so many opportunities to automate and improve technology that even when India grows at 7% per annum, which it was before the COVID crisis, it can grow GDP at 7% per annum and deliver higher living standards to the emerging middle class without needing to employ this rapidly growing working age population, which therefore is not a demographic dividend at all, but a sort of demographic delusion or a demographic disadvantage.
Now, I think you can also say this is very yesterday's thinking. The idea that a country has to increase its population in order to increase its productivity and its consumption, that's yesterday's thinking. Because of this, we obviously have technology, and if we are concerned about jobs and skills, etc., we know that automation, if anything, is going to take away jobs, and this probably is the way that we should be thinking.
There was a question earlier on about how can we live with less stuff. We don't have to go back to living like something in the dark ages. We need to go back to living like perhaps people did in the 1940s or 1950s, where they don't have 50 pairs of shoes and 12 suits, and they don't go to exotic holidays in the Seychelles, and they don't replace their electronic goods every 18 months.
When you reach a certain standard of needs met through these public services and other systems like democracy, income equality, energy demand as an absolute tends to be relatively low. And if you add further energy demand, you're not really doing much, as I've said, to the need satisfaction. That's a key inference from this report. Conversely, they talk about negative provisioning factors. You've got the positives, which is public services, universal access to, say, transport, democracy, things like that. You've got the opposites, which are what is called extractivism or rampant economic growth. So in those circumstances where countries are facing that in more acutely, what we see is, as it says here, beyond moderate levels of affluence are associated with lower need satisfaction. So again, take India, for example. We are growing quite rapidly over the last couple of decades. But what we've seen, of course, is without a provision of a proper safety net, without a provision of basic welfare services, you have massive inequality, the negative factor that I'm talking about, massive inequality there. And ultimately, the way to the only way forward seems to be to keep putting on more and more energy demand on the system without really thinking about how do you equalize energy needs and need satisfaction across the country. So I think that's a key inference for policy. The reason why I only talk about this, tons of other policies we can think about, is to really bring together the social policy dimension, the welfare dimension, along with the climate crisis as well. Because you can't really think about purely in terms of carbon. We need to think about carbon plus the wider social policy environment that we live in.
One of the things that we do is we calculate how much solutions will move the date of Earth Overshoot Day if implemented at scale. So, for example, energy retrofit, like building retrofits using completely existing technology, could move, just if those were just implemented at scale, that could move the date 21, 22 days. So it doesn't require coming up with some brand new technology. It doesn't require some techno fix. It's just a matter of really getting that out there and deploying at scale. But I will say that, you know, one of the most important long-term solutions in terms of the number of days that we can move the date by implementing is girls' education, right? And that is something that we ought to be doing for social justice reasons, for the reasons of, that it's the right thing to do, but also because it's making lives better, as Robin already mentioned, at the community level. And it also has a very large, I think is something, depending on which numbers you use, something like 49 days moved if we expand girls' education throughout the world.
If we want to have drastic changes, where are the leverage points that we can enact that? And we've identified 5. There are 5 of them, and one of them I can say is related to population and specifically gender equality. If you, and very much aligned with my findings, which is if you give people, especially women, access to education and health services, which of course include family planning, that is one of the key leverage points to avert a societal collapse.
Our planet simply cannot continue to have huge childbearing, particularly from high-income, high-consuming countries.
Fertility rates probably below replacement level are, I think, close to inevitable, provided we are able to spread prosperity, women's education, and women's freedom to choose their own fertility across the world. And I think it's pretty odd if we don't want to spread those 3 things across the world.
So population boom or bust, what every country needs is zero population growth, really.
If we continue business as usual, there's a good risk that we're facing ecosystem collapse.
There are some takeouts from the conference, but I think one of the great benefits of being in the audience is you hear all the presentations and you're constantly changing your mind. You're thinking, oh, I thought I knew this, and then hang on, what's about that? And I found the morning very, very sobering in terms of the realities that Graham Maxton pointed out. And then I found, that Jeroen Vandenberg showed me a different view, a different way of looking at the economy, and that there were some possibly sort of really optimistic routes. And then I started finding, again, some pretty hard stories in terms of, what's facing sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly across the Sahel in terms of climate change. And, the very optimistic views of actually we can balance our population decline in the north with justified and intelligent migration of young people coming to fill some of the jobs that may be available, but then looking at what climate change is presenting, whether that is going to happen in time and be enabled, given that hundreds of millions of people may need to be on the move. If you look at some of the population growth projected in sub-Saharan Africa and the temperature rise. So all the time there's opportunities and then there's challenges, and there is no easy route through it. But we at Population Matters, this is a real starter for us in terms of understanding the economic underpinning of our agenda, and hence this conference. But we've also been talking to economists and demographers across the world to think about how we could host, if you like, a network of some of the thinkers we've heard today, of how do we propose positive solutions for our challenges in the global north, which are not as big as we hear at times, certainly in terms of Lord Turner's presentation of aging societies and declining populations. We heard from Letitia that actually every country should go for a net zero growth in terms of the ongoing benefits. But we're going to try and develop that work such that we have positive solutions and workable solutions with thinkers, as we've heard today, for both the global north and the global south, which are facing very different scenarios. So that's as much as I wanted to say, and just thank you so much for lasting through a very demanding day, technically, but also in terms of the amount of information we took in. And thank you to those 400 people around the world who have been logging in as well. And it's just great to be part of a global community. If that's one thing we've learned from today, this is not about them or us or others and ourselves. This is about all of us together. And I think, again, may have been Chaitanya was talking about, a collaborative economy rather than a competitive economy. We are all interconnected, as the climate has really proven to us. So thank you very much all and everyone for attending.